Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellmite here, bringing you another video from Grab the Lantern today. Today's video is going to be talking all about value and how to guarantee that you will have value regardless of what is happening in the game that you are in. Now, we have all been here before where you've either made a mistake or you've gotten early ganked by a enemy jungler, or either way, maybe you're in a counter pick matchup and things are just not going well for you. But either way, everyone has been in a situation where you look up at the scoreboard and it's 5 minutes in the game and you're 0-3 on your favorite champion. And all of a sudden, the question becomes less of, can I win lane, and more of, can I do anything in this game? Am I going to be a valued member of the team, or am I going to be a complete liability the whole time I'm in this game? So these are essentially tips and tricks to make sure that you can guarantee that no matter what happens in a game, that you have a way to gain value, that you have a way to provide value to your team, and that you will always be doing something to have an impact on the game. Now, value is a bit of a loose concept, so let me explain more what I mean. A lot of times, value is going to be concepts that essentially don't require you to scale, don't require you to have access to items in order to provide something to the team, and especially things that don't have to scale. So a stun is a stun no matter what. And that's going to be valuable to your team regardless of how much damage the stun does. The stun could do 0 damage, but just the fact that the enemy champion isn't moving for even a second and a half, or sorry, half a second and a half would be a really good stun, but half a second stun, okay, cool, that's still some degree of value that you're providing to your team, because that stun doesn't have to scale with anything, it doesn't have to do any damage, it's generically good regardless of what game you are currently playing. Like, there's no other way to slice it. And so those are things that, if your champion can provide them to your team, slows or stuns or other crowd control, like, there is no way to mess that up. There is no way that that's not useful to your team. Now, sometimes the question is, how long will you survive in order to apply these crowd control effects, which may or may not be very long, but the fact that you do offer them does mean that your champion has some degree of value that they can provide, regardless of how fed they are. Obviously, this is assuming you have access to your full kit, but most every champion in the game is going to at least hit level 6 in a game, so that shouldn't be too big of a problem. Champions do have other ways of providing value as well. A champion like Ornn provides value to his team thanks to his item upgrades, essentially putting everyone in his team 1,000 gold up on their enemy components. And other champions like Fiddlesticks can provide value in interesting ways due to Fiddlesticks' ability to really play the vision game well and to provide some fake out fiddles throughout the map that the enemy team kind of have to evaluate and kind of have to be a little bit afraid of in order to make sure that that's not the real Fiddlesticks and they're not about to get ganked. So these are generally speaking what I mean, and as long as your champion has something they can do in regards to that kind of value, that you are always going to have an impact, but a lot of that is going to be dependent on the champions that you're playing. If you are a tank player or a support player, you're almost guaranteed to have an impact on the game because you're bringing crowd control, you're bringing durability, and supports in general are champions that are designed to operate on a limited income, that are designed first and foremost with their utility in mind. Now, there are some modern day supports like Senna and Pyke that are slightly less about just straight utility, and they do have a little bit more of an emphasis on playing for the scaling build, playing for gaining gold due to their various passives and getting ahead in that regard. But generally speaking, if you're a tank player or support player, you have value that you can provide to your team. You almost never need to worry about all the stuff I'm talking about right now. If you're a mage player, mages generally have at least 1 or 2 abilities that provide them with some utility. So if you fall behind on a champion like, let's say, Xerath or Karthus, it may be worth it to max that ability, your utility abilities first instead of your damage, because yeah, sure, you're not going to do that much damage regardless, but if you are able to provide a very powerful slow from something like Wall of Pain, or look for picks with something like Shocking Orb, there is at least a little bit of value, again, that you can provide there for your team if you realize, I'm not going to be doing any damage this game because of how far behind I am. And so now, some of the problem is that not every class of the game has the ability to provide utility. In fact, AD carries, Juggernauts, and Assassins tend to have very low utility because of who they are. They're most likely to be in a situation, as described above, where they're basically not doing any damage. They're sort of sitting there dying, not doing damage, not being tanky, and not providing any utility to their team whatsoever. Now, there are ways to mitigate this because there are still champions in every role that can provide some degree of value. AD carries, we talk a lot about the utility marksman like Ashe, who she, at the very least, provides slows. She has scouting with Hawkshot. She has Enchanted Crystal Arrow for ultimate setups. Like, she has the ability to provide some degree of value, even if a champion like Draven doesn't really provide a lot of utility if he falls behind. Juggernauts and Assassins are even harder to provide value on if you do fall behind because of who they are. They tend to be very high risk, high reward champions in that if they get ahead, they're going to be able to do a ton of damage. They're going to be able to just kind of carry the game outright. But if they get behind, they're not going to be able to do very much because they may not even have the damage to assassinate their preferred targets, which is just sort of a problem with the class itself. I wouldn't say problem, but sort of a trade-off on the class itself. So, but they even still, some of these champions can have something they can do for their team. Garen, for example, has a targeted silence. He can get in there and at least silence an enemy team member and make it so that the rest of your team can exploit that. You have a champion like Zed who, yeah, he doesn't do a lot, but ideally a good Zed player can sort of play the footsie game using his ultimate and his W to just provide a distraction, even if he's not trying to kill someone in earnest, but if he's at least saying, oh, look at me, I'm Zed, I'm going for the big play, don't you want to kill me? He can at least provide value in that degree, but it's a little bit harder to do that. So sometimes what you can end up doing is attempting to exploit the map for value instead of just trying to build up and do damage. Juggernauts and Assassins can split push much better than other classes because they tend to be more individualistic and they tend to be a little bit better on their own. So it's a lot easier for them to kind of walk into a side lane and split push and say, hey, someone has to answer me. And essentially you're hoping for one of two things. Either the enemy team sends multiple members to deal with you, at which point you're kind of hoping you can either get out of that situation, or that your team is able to exploit the fact that they sent two people to deal with your underfed Juggernaut or Assassin so they can win a 4v3 elsewhere on the map. Or that the enemy team sends their most fed enemy team member to match you. At which point, okay, sure, yeah, you sent your 5-0 Tryndamere to match my 0-5 Garen. That's totally fine, I don't care, because that's way more valuable to you than it is to me to have the Tryndamere in the top lane versus anywhere else. So if he's not trying to exploit the rest of the map, then that's totally fine if I'm able to sort of hold him in this side lane. So there are ways to kind of influence the map to help out with that. You can also always just look for isolated waves to farm, which will help you try to catch up. If you just stop playing the PvP game for a little bit, sort of saying, I am not even remotely going to try and fight champions. If they show up in the lane, I'm backing off the tower. I just want to get CS. One of the things you can do is essentially manage waves and keep them in a spot where the enemy team can't exploit them in that regard. And all the while you are farming to attempt to catch up. A lot of games you can sort of get back into the game and start providing value to your team via damage if you're just sort of able to say, all I want to do is farm, all I'm going to do is sit back and get CS and eventually catch up on gold and experience. And remember, if any game goes late enough, you will always catch up in those regards because champions will cap out on items, they will cap out on experience, and at that point, you will do nothing but close the gap. But on that note, there's also the concept of building to provide your team with more value. It's always possible to itemize once you've realized you're behind to maximize the amount of value that you can provide the team, to maximize the amount of utility you can provide your team. Tanks can always buy a Knight's Vow, even if they're not able to personally get tanky because they're so far behind. They can always buy something like a Knight's Vow in order to just say, hey, AD carry, I am going to at least give you some degree of damage reduction to keep you alive in fights just a little bit longer at my own expense. It doesn't matter, I was going to die in this fight anyways, but at least this gives you a fighting chance to keep yourself alive if someone's trying to assassinate you. Juggernauts can essentially start building tank instead of plowing ahead with a greedy damage build. Obviously, Juggernauts really just kind of want to say, I want to build everything with a damage component, but especially with the new item system, it's a lot more viable for a champion like Garen to say, wow, I'm doing super bad in lane, I'm just going to buy Sunfire Cape, because it's going to make him tanky, which sometimes that's all you really need is just a warm body to occupy the front line, to run at the enemy team, and even if they're not going to get any value by actually getting to them and applying crowd control or applying damage, the fact that they are more durable than the enemy team expects does sort of mean that they provide value in that regard by making space and doing things that a main tank can do. Mages can always itemize for penetration or percent health damage, which at least doesn't require you being ahead in order to scale. If you're doing 3% of an enemy champion's health as magic damage, that's still 3% health. That doesn't have to scale off of anything. It just says how much health do they have. So it's going to do a fixed amount of damage almost regardless, which does mean that they have some value. And again, the new item system helps out with this a ton. If you realize you're behind in mid lane, you're going 0-3 into a Zed, you haven't even finished an item, start building a Liandry's Torment. There's no reason to plow ahead with a greedier item like Luden's Tempest, which you will get, sure, but it may not provide you with the damage you want, when you could go Liandry's Anguish and just say, yeah, cool, I'm going to be providing that burn in order to do some degree of damage regardless of what happens, and every random skill shot I land, there is going to be some degree of value that gets provided there. And even if you are an assassin who doesn't have any value on his own, you can always buy an Umbral Glaive as one of your first items and at least play the Vision game. There's no reason to go for that Duskblade if you don't think you're going to be able to kill enemy champions either way. You may as well instead go for the Umbral Glaive and play the Vision game, which is always a recommendation, is just playing the Vision game, buying wards, keeping track of them and where the enemy team is at, and essentially working on shot calling for your team and shouting out like, hey guys, you know, here's where they are. Make sure that you guys are aware that they are in this area, or that they walked over this ward, or that they clear this vision, or placing vision for your team. All of that can be value that you can provide to your team. Anyways, I know this was a bit of an esoteric concept, so let me know what you guys thought of this down in the comment section below, especially if you have any questions about how you can provide value in your games. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts down in the comment section, so go ahead and let me know. If you enjoyed today's video, go ahead and leave a like, and if you really enjoyed today's video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it, and I'll talk to you all later.